That is entirely up to you. One of the problems that Britain has right now is it still hasn't figured out what the hell it wants to do about Brexit. I mean, come on, guys, it's been 5 years.
Tell me about it.
The smart play would be to go to Washington and ask for a deep free trade deal and maybe inclusion into NAFTA. The problem with that strategy is that we have treated you exactly the same in these talks as we treated you during Lend-Lease. So we gave you in Lend-Lease 40-odd outdated, badly constructed, mothballed destroyers in exchange for every military facility you had in the Western Hemisphere. That's the scale of the capitulation that Washington is going to demand. That means all your deals with Ireland or on Northern Ireland have to stick because we like those. That means you have to surrender to American agricultural norms, which means most of your farms will go out of business. And that means that the financial hub needs to move from London to New York. I mean, these are non-negotiable from the American point of view, and that's one of the reasons why the trade deal has not happened. The rhetoric of the Brexiters that they would just be able to go to Washington and get a better deal, not true. But what the Americans are demanding is the best you are going to get. And unless the UK comes to that conclusion on itself, then it is trapped at the edge of the European system. Now, the European system is facing its own mortal problems, but you can no longer be part of whatever the planning is for the next stage. And that does leave you kind of out on your own. And long-range manufacturing supply chains are no longer viable anyway. So you do need to partner with someone. And that either means crawling back to the EU, which I don't think is a viable option anymore. Well, let's start with kind of the conventional wisdom, because it's not all wrong. I'm usually the guy who pokes that, but not this time. Net zero with today's technology until we have figured out a low-cost mass storage electricity system. And that means storing electricity not for 4 hours, but for 4 months, so you can make it through the winter. Until we have that technology, net zero is really dumb from an environmental point of view. Forget from an economic point of view. It's suicidal from an economic point of view. But from an environmental point of view, there isn't enough lithium on the planet to make that work. Now, in the UK, you do have advantages over almost everyone else in your hemisphere because the UK has some of the best wind resources of the world. And if you put a wind turbine high enough, you can tap stronger currents that are more reliable that can actually generate base load. We're seeing that in the North Sea. In the United States, we're seeing that in Texas, and we're seeing that in Iowa. It's not foolproof, but wow, is it better than what we had 5 or 10 years ago. So I don't mean to suggest you can't green your system. I'm just saying that getting to zero today is not possible. And if you try, and if you do it by decommissioning more reliable energy producing systems, which almost by default means nuclear or fossil fuel, you are going to have high prices and rolling brown and blackouts. We are seeing that across Central Europe right now. The technology just isn't there. So it's real. That doesn't mean you should give up. People have ideas. People have bad ideas, and politicians of all flavors strap onto them. We've certainly seen that in my country in the last 5 years. You are not unique in that. So whether that makes you feel better or worse, I do not know. But I certainly agree that net zero in its current form with today's technology is economically and ecologically suicidal. But that's only one piece. So we've got the Ukraine war then. The Russians have recently shut off Nord Stream, and we know that all the pipelines that are crossing Ukraine to Europe are going to get blown up one way or another this calendar year. So you can count on roughly 4 to 6 million barrels a day of crude, and roughly, I got to translate this one. Sorry, I'm thinking BCF. It's 9 to 12 BCF. So what's that? 90 to 120 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year going offline before the end of the year. And that will obviously sucker punch everyone in Europe repeatedly. Again, UK has a little different system. You're further from the Russians. You hardly use any of their stuff. You have the option of taking stuff from the North Sea first. You have closer access to LNG from the United States. So you're going to be able to watch Europe. And when you're not giggling, because that would be rude, you're hopefully going to learn a few things on what not to do as you're adjusting your own energy plans. But all of that is going to be inflationary no matter who you are. We're losing potash fertilizer that used to come from Russia and Belarus. We're losing phosphate fertilizer, which used to come from China, and we are losing nitrogen fertilizer, which is made from natural gas globally. So we know food prices have to go up. Again, I don't see the UK starving, but that contributes to inflation. But what's really going on, in my opinion, is a labor story. In the UK, in the US, our largest generation has been our baby boomers. They're all retiring right now. And the kids who are 0 to 20 who are now moving into the workforce, they are the smallest generation that either of our countries has ever seen. In the United States, that is already an annual shortage of 400,000 workers. In my country, that's going to go up for the next 12 years until we hit 900,000. So we are looking at labor inflation here being higher than inflation in energy and food and manufactured goods combined for a decade. That's a lot more difficult than it sounds. Now, the advantage we've had in the United States is we've got the elbow room. We're the world's largest producer and exporter of food. We're the world's largest producer of energy products. And we have more arable land per person than any other country in the world. And that has kept the costs for all of the inputs for families low without a government policy. The UK is lower productivity in its agriculture. Its energy reserves aren't tapped out, but they're well past their peak. And most of you live in a relatively dense urban environment. That's just by nature is going to be more expensive. So if you do decide you want to fix this with policy, the country to have a conversation with is Sweden, and not so much about what to do, but about what not to do. Sweden has maintained a higher birth rate than most countries, certainly most countries in Europe, and they do have a cradle-to-grave social support network. But it's come with some of the highest tax rates in the world, which actually makes Sweden a very expensive place to live. If it wasn't for the support, no one would be able to have a family. In addition, there are a lot of societal negatives that come from it. So, for example, they've got this great program where a young mother with her first kid gets so many months off work with pay. If she has a second kid, it adds on an additional time plus some. Same for a third, same for a fourth. What that means is that if you're under age 35 in Sweden and you're a woman, it's impossible to get hired. Because you could go in for your first day of work, say you're pregnant, and then not work a day for 8 years. So yes, higher birth rate, but it comes at the cost of just screaming economic inequality between the sexes. This is hard. Social engineering is incredibly difficult. It will always have side effects. The United States has been fortunate in that geography takes care of most of it for us. And they're not going away. I mean, the baby boomers are the largest generation the West has ever had, and they're going away and they are never coming back. In the United States, we have to wait 10 years for the millennials to kind of fill this out. Most of the advanced world doesn't have a millennial generation. So we're not going back to where we were pre-COVID or pre-Trump. That is not possible. We don't have the numbers. We have to find a new way to function. And if you want to get a little optimistic / depressed, it all depends on your point of view. If I'm right about China,
crack on.
Yeah. If I'm right about China and we're looking at the disintegration of the Chinese system, and if I'm right about Germany and we're looking at the end of the German system this year, that's a lot of manufacturing that is going away. Now, your country and my country are excellent at manufacturing. In terms of value added, we're actually better than the Germans. But to rebuild those supply chains somewhere else, especially in short order, especially during a time of protracted labor shortages, that is also inflationary. By the numbers, that has a possibility of working. Now, in the European Union, that is exactly what you did for the last 15 years, and it's one of the reasons why the Central European economies are now facing demographic collapse. Everyone who's under 30 left for the West, or the Western European countries. You can only do that once. So you're talking about now going further afield. In that, the United Kingdom absolutely has an advantage over the rest of the EU because the UK has always had a more open definition of self, because by definition, the UK is a merger of multiple ethnicities without necessarily erasing them in the way that the French did or the Germans did. And that makes you a little bit more culturally open, but it will not happen by accident. You're a freaking island. And You just need to build the system that allows them to come in either from the former colonies or from countries that are closer. There are ways to skin that cat. All of them generate a degree of political backlash, and I think it's safe to say that everyone in the UK right now has a fresh appreciation for just how touchy you can be when it comes to your politics. In the United States, we learned that lesson 5 years ago with Donald Trump, and for people who thought that all it was going to take was the fall of Trump and the rise of Biden to change it, no. Our immigration policy is, if anything, tighter now than it was 2 years ago. This requires a significant cultural adaptation. We go through phases, and right now, both countries kind of like the doors shut.